International Short Stories, Volume 2. English Stories. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Edward Kirkby. International Short Stories, Volume 2. English Stories, edited by William Patton. Section 17. The Sire De Maletroit's Door, by R.L. Stevenson. Part 1. Denis de Beaulieu was not yet 22, but he counted himself a grown man, and a very accomplished cavalier into the bargain. Lads were early formed in that rough warfaring epoch, and when one has been in a pitched battle and a dozen raids, has killed one's man in an honourable fashion, and knows a thing or two of strategy and mankind, a certain swagger in the gait is surely to be pardoned. He had put up his horse with due care, and supped with due deliberation, and then, in a very agreeable frame of mind, went out to pay a visit in the grey of the evening. It was not a very wise proceeding on the young man's part. He would have done better to remain beside the fire, or go decently to bed. For the town was full of the troops of Burgundy and England, under a mixed command, and though Denis was there on safe conduct, his safe conduct was like to serve him little on a chance encounter. It was September 1429. The weather had fallen sharp. A flighty, piping wind, laden with showers, beat about the township, and the dead leaves ran riot along the streets. Here and there a window was already lighted up, and the noise of men-at-arms making merry over supper within came forth in fits and was swallowed up and carried away by the wind. The night fell swiftly. The flag of England, fluttering on the spire top, grew ever fainter and fainter against the flying clouds, a black speck like a swallow in the tumultuous leaden chaos of the sky. As the night fell, the wind rose, and began to hoot under archways and roar amid the tree-tops in the valley below the town. Denis de Beaulieu walked fast, and was soon knocking at his friend's door, but though he promised himself to stay only a little while and make an early return, his welcome was so pleasant, and he found so much to delay him, that it was already long past midnight before he said good-bye upon the threshold. The wind had fallen again in the meanwhile. The night was as black as the grave. Not a star, nor a glimmer of moonshine, slipped through the canopy of cloud. Denis was ill acquainted with the intricate lanes of Chateau Landon. Even by daylight he had found some trouble in picking his way, and in this absolute darkness he soon lost it altogether. He was certain of one thing only, to keep mounting the hill, for his friend's house lay at the lower end or tail of Chateau Landon, while the inn was up at the head, under the great church spire. With this clue to go upon, he stumbled and groped forward, now breathing more freely in open places, where there was a good slice of sky overhead, now feeling along the wall in stifling closes. It is an eerie and mysterious position to be thus submerged in opaque blackness in an almost unknown town. The silence is terrifying in its possibilities. The touch of cold window bars to the exploring hand startles the man like the touch of a toad. The inequalities of the pavement shake his heart into his mouth. A piece of denser darkness threatens an ambuscade or a chasm in the pathway, and where the air is brighter the houses put on strange and bewildering appearances, as if to lead him further from his way. For Denis, who had to regain his inn without attracting notice, there was real danger, as well as mere discomfort in the walk, and he went warily and boldly at once, and at every corner paused to make an observation. He had been for some time threading a lane so narrow that he could touch a wall with either hand when it began to open out and go sharply downward. Plainly this lay no longer in the direction of his inn, but the hope of a little more light tempted him forward to reconnoitre. The lane ended in a terrace with a bartizan wall, which gave an outlook between high houses as out of an embrasure into the valley lying dark and formless several hundred feet below. Denis looked down and could discern a few tree-tops waving, and a single speck of brightness where the river ran across a weir. The weather was clearing up, and the sky had lightened so as to show the outline of the heavier clouds and the dark margin of the hills. By the uncertain glimmer, the house on his left hand should be a place of some pretensions. It was surmounted by several pinnacles and turret tops. The round stern of a chapel, with a fringe of flying buttresses, projected boldly from the main block. The door was sheltered under a deep porch, carved with figures, and overhung by two long gargoyles. The windows of the chapel gleamed through the intricate tracery with a light as of many tapers, and threw out the buttresses and the peaked roof in a more intense blackness against the sky. It was plainly the hotel of some great family of the neighbourhood, and as it reminded Denis of a town house of his own at Bourges, he stood for some time gazing up at it and mentally gauging the skill of the architects and the consideration of the two families. There seemed to be no issue to the terrace but the lane by which he had reached it. He could only retrace his steps, but he had gained some notion of his whereabout, and hoped by this means to hit the main thoroughfare and speedily regain the inn. He was reckoning without that chapter of accidents which was to make this night memorable above all others in his career, for he had not gone back above 100 yards before he saw a light coming to meet him, and heard loud voices speaking together in the echoing narrows of the lane. It was a party of men-at-arms going the night round with torches. Denis assured himself that they had all been making free with the wine bowl, and were in no mood to be particular about safe conducts, or the niceties of chivalrous war. It was like as not that they would kill him like a dog, and leave him where he fell. The situation was inspiriting, but nervous. Their own torches would conceal him from sight, he reflected, and he hoped that they would drown the noise of his footsteps with their own empty voices. If he were but fleet and silent, he might evade their notice altogether. Unfortunately, as he turned to beat a retreat, his foot rolled upon a pebble. He fell against the wall with an ejaculation, and his sword rang loudly on the stones. 2 or 3 voices demanded who went there, some in French, some in English, but Denis made no reply, and ran the faster down the lane. Once upon the terrace, he paused to look back. They still kept calling after him, and just then began to double the pace in pursuit, with a considerable clank of armour, and great tossing of the torchlight to and fro in the narrow jaws of the passage. Denis cast a look around, and darted into the porch. There he might escape observation, or, if that were too much to expect, was in a capital posture whether for parley or defence. So thinking, he drew his sword, and tried to set his back against the door. To his surprise it yielded behind his weight, and though he turned in a moment, continued to swing back on oiled and noiseless hinges until it stood wide open on a black interior. When things fall out opportunely for the person concerned, he is not apt to be critical about the how or why, his own immediate personal convenience seeming a sufficient reason for the strangest oddities and resolutions in our sublunary things, and so Denis, without a moment's hesitation, stepped within and partly closed the door behind him to conceal his place of refuge. Nothing was further from his thoughts than to close it altogether, but for some inexplicable reason, perhaps by a spring or a weight, the ponderous mass of oak whipped itself out of his fingers and clanked to, with a formidable rumble and a noise like the falling of an automatic bar. The round at that very moment debauched upon the terrace, and proceeded to summon him with shouts and curses. He heard them ferreting in the dark corners. The stock of a lance even rattled along the outer surface of the door behind which he stood. But these gentlemen were in too high a humour to be long delayed, and soon made off down a corkscrew pathway which had escaped Denis's observation, and passed out of sight and hearing along the battlements of the town. Denis breathed again. He gave them a few minutes' grace for fear of accidents, and then groped about for some means of opening the door and slipping forth again. The inner surface was quite smooth, not a handle, not a moulding, not a projection of any sort. He got his fingernails round the edges and pulled, but the mass was immovable. He shook it. It was as firm as a rock. Denis de Beaulieu frowned and gave vent to a little noiseless whistle. What ailed the door, he wondered. Why was it open? How came it to shut so easily and so effectually after him? There was something obscure and underhand about all this that was little to the young man's fancy. It looked like a snare, and yet who could suppose a snare in such a quiet by-street, and in a house of so prosperous and even noble an exterior? And yet, snare or no snare, intentionally or unintentionally, here he was, prettily trapped, and for the life of him he could see no way out of it again. The darkness began to weigh upon him. He gave ear. All was silent without, but within and close by he seemed to catch a faint sighing, a faint sobbing rustle, a little stealthy creak, as though many persons were at his side, holding themselves quite still and governing even their respiration with the extreme of slyness. The idea went to his vitals with a shock, and he faced about suddenly as if to defend his life. Then, for the first time, he became aware of a light about the level of his eyes and at some distance in the interior of the house, a vertical thread of light widening toward the bottom, such as might escape between two wings of a wrasse over a doorway. To see anything was a relief to Denis. It was like a piece of solid ground to a man labouring in a morass. His mind seized upon it with avidity, and he stood staring at it and trying to piece together some logical conception of his surroundings. Plainly there was a flight of steps ascending from his own level to that of this illuminated doorway, and indeed he thought he could make out another thread of light, as fine as a needle and as faint as phosphorescence, which might very well be reflected along the polished wood of a handrail. Since he had begun to suspect that he was not alone, his heart had continued to beat with smothering violence, and an intolerable desire for action of any sort had possessed itself of his spirit. He was in deadly peril, he believed. What could be more natural than to mount the staircase, lift the curtain, and confront his difficulty at once? At least he would be dealing with something tangible. At least he would be no longer in the dark. He stepped slowly forward with outstretched hands until his foot struck the bottom step. Then he rapidly scaled the stairs, stood for a moment to compose his expression, lifted the arras, and went in. He found himself in a large apartment of polished stone. There were 3 doors, one on each of 3 sides, all similarly curtained with tapestry. The 4th side was occupied by 2 large windows and a great stone chimney-piece, carved with the arms of the Maletroits. Denis recognized the bearings, and he was gratified to find himself in such good hands. The room was strongly illuminated, but it contained little furniture, except a heavy table and a chair or two. The hearth was innocent of fire, and the pavement was but sparsely strewn with rushes, clearly many days old. On a high chair beside the chimney, and directly facing Denis as he entered, sat a little old gentleman in a fur tippet. He sat with his legs crossed and his hands folded, and a cup of spiced wine stood by his elbow on a bracket on the wall. His countenance had a strongly masculine cast, not properly human, but such as we see in the bull, the goat, or the domestic boar, something equivocal and wheedling, something greedy, brutal, and dangerous. The upper lip was inordinately full, as though swollen by a blow or a toothache, and the smile, the peaked eyebrows, and the small, strong eyes were quaintly and almost comically evil in expression. Beautiful white hair hung straight all round his head, like a saint's, and fell in a single curl upon the tippet. His beard and moustache were the pink of venerable sweetness. Age, probably in consequence of inordinate precautions, had left no mark upon his hands, and the Maletroit hand was famous. It would be difficult to imagine anything at once so fleshy and so delicate in design. The tapered, sensual fingers were like those of one of Leonardo's women. The fork of the thumb made a dimpled protuberance when closed. The nails were perfectly shaped and of a dead, surprising whiteness. It rendered his aspect tenfold more redoubtable that a man with hands like these should keep them devoutly folded in his lap, like a virgin martyr, that a man with so intense and startling an expression of face should sit patiently on his seat and contemplate people with an unwinking stare, like a god or a god statue. His quiescence seemed ironical and treacherous, it fitted so poorly with his looks. Such was Alan Sire de Maletroit. Denis and he looked silently at each other for a second or two. "Pray step in," said the Sire de Maletroit. "I have been expecting you all the evening." He had not risen, but he accompanied his words with a smile and a slight but courteous inclination of the head. Partly from the smile, partly from the strange musical murmur with which the seer prefaced his observation, Denis felt a strong shudder of disgust go through his marrow. And what with disgust and honest confusion of mind, he could scarcely get words together in reply. "I fear," he said, "that this is a double accident. I'm not the person you suppose me. It seems you were looking for a visit. But for my part, nothing was further from my thoughts. Nothing could be more contrary to my wishes than this intrusion." "Well, well," replied the old gentleman indulgently, "here you are, which is the main point. Seat yourself, my friend, and put yourself entirely at your ease. We shall arrange our little affairs presently." Denis perceived that the matter was still complicated with some misconception, and he hastened to continue his explanations. "Your door," he began. "About my door?" asked the other, raising his peaked eyebrows. "A little piece of ingenuity," and he shrugged his shoulders. "A hospitable fancy. By your own account, you were not desirous of making my acquaintance. We old people look for such reluctance now and then, and when it touches our Homer we cast about until we find some way of overcoming it. You arrived uninvited, but believe me, very welcome." "You persist in error, sir," said Denis. "There can be no question between you and me. I am a stranger in this countryside. My name is Denis Damaso de Beaulieu. If you see me in your house, it is only—" "My young friend," interrupted the other, "you will permit me to have my own ideas on that subject. They probably differ from yours at the present moment," he added with a leer, "but time will show which of us is in the right." Denis was convinced he had to do with a lunatic. He seated himself with a shrug, content to wait the upshot, and a pause ensued, during which he thought he could distinguish a hurried gabbling as of prayer from behind the arras immediately opposite him. Sometimes there seemed to be but one person engaged, sometimes two, and the vehemence of the voice, low as it was, seemed to indicate either great haste or an agony of spirit. It occurred to him that this piece of tapestry covered the entrance to the chapel he had noticed from without. The old gentleman meanwhile surveyed Denis from head to foot with a smile, and from time to time emitted little noises like a bird or a mouse, which seemed to indicate a high degree of satisfaction. This state of matters became rapidly insupportable, and Denis, to put an end to it, remarked politely that the wind had gone down. The old gentleman fell into a fit of silent laughter, so prolonged and violent that he became quite red in the face. Denis got upon his feet at once, and put on his hat with a flourish. "Sir," he said, "if you are in your wits, you have affronted me grossly. If you are out of them, I flatter myself I can find better employment for my brains than to talk with lunatics. My conscience is clear. You have made a fool of me from the first moment. You have refused to hear my explanations, and now there is no power under God will make me stay here any longer, and if I cannot make my way out in a more decent fashion, I will hack your door in pieces with my sword." The Sire de Maletroit raised his right hand and wagged it at Denis, with the fore and little fingers extended. "My dear nephew," he said, "sit down." "Nephew?" retorted Denis. "You lie in your throat," and he snapped his fingers in his face. "Sit down, you rogue!" cried the old gentleman, in a sudden harsh voice like the barking of a dog. "Do you fancy," he went on, "that when I had made my little contrivance for the door I had stopped short with that? If you prefer to be bound hand and foot till your bones ache, rise and try to go away. If you choose to remain a free young buck, agreeably conversing with an old gentleman, why, sit where you are in peace, and God be with you." "Do you mean I am a prisoner?" demanded Denis. "I state the facts," replied the other. "I would rather leave the conclusion to yourself." Denis sat down again. Externally he managed to keep pretty calm, but within he was boiling with anger, now chilled with apprehension. He no longer felt convinced that he was dealing with a madman. And if the old gentleman was sane, what in God's name had he to look for? What absurd or tragical adventure had befallen him? What countenance was he to assume? While he was thus unpleasantly reflecting, the arras that overhung the chapel door was raised, and a tall priest in his robes came forth, and, giving a long, keen stare at Denis, said something in an undertone to Sire De Maletroit. "She is in a better frame of spirit?" asked the latter. "She is more resigned, Messire," replied the priest. "Now the Lord help her, she is hard to please," sneered the old gentleman. "A likely stripling, not ill born, and of her own choosing, too. Why, what more would the jade have?" "The situation is not unusual for a young damsel," said the other, "and somewhat trying to her blushes." "She should have thought of that before she began the dance. It was none of my choosing, God knows that, but since she is in it, by Our Lady, she shall carry it to the end." And then, addressing Denis, "Monsieur de Beaulieu," he asked, "may I present you to my niece? She has been waiting your arrival, I may say, with an even greater impatience than myself." Denis had resigned himself with a good grace. All he desired was to know the worst of it as speedily as possible, so he rose at once and bowed in acquiescence. The Sire de Maletroit followed his example and limped, with the assistance of the chaplain's arm, toward the chapel door. The priest pulled aside the arras, and all three entered. The building had considerable architectural pretensions. A light groining sprang from 6 stout columns, and hung down in 2 rich pendants from the centre of the vault. The place terminated behind the altar in a round end, embossed and honeycombed, with a superfluity of ornament in relief, and pierced by many little windows, shaped like stars, trefoils, or wheels. These windows were imperfectly glazed, so that the night air circulated freely in the chapel. The tapers, of which there must have been 100 burning on the altar, were unmercifully blown about, and the light went through many different phases of brilliancy and semi-eclipse. On the steps in front of the altar knelt a young girl, richly attired as a bride. A chill settled over Denis as he observed her costume. He fought with a desperate energy against the conclusion that was being thrust upon his mind. It could not, it should not, be as he feared. "Blanche," said the seer, in his most flute-like tones, "I have brought a friend to see you, my little girl. Turn round and give him your pretty hand. It is good to be devout, but it is necessary to be polite, my niece." The girl rose to her feet and turned toward the newcomers. She moved all of a piece, and shame and exhaustion were expressed in every line of her fresh young body, and she held her head down and kept her eyes upon the pavement as she came slowly forward. In the course of her advance, her eyes fell upon Denis de Beaulieu's feet, feet of which he was justly vain, be it remarked, and wore in the most elegant accoutrement even while travelling. She paused, started, as if his yellow boots had conveyed some shocking meaning, and glanced suddenly up into the wearer's countenance. Their eyes met. Shame gave place to horror and terror in her looks. The blood left her lips. With a piercing scream she covered her face with her hands and sank upon the chapel floor. "That is not the man!" she cried. "My uncle, that is not the man!" The Sire de Maletroit chirped agreeably. "Of course not," he said. "I expected as much. It was so unfortunate you could not remember his name." "Indeed," she cried, "indeed, I have never seen this person till this moment. I have never so much as set eyes upon him. I never wish to see him again. Sir," she said, turning to Denis, "if you are a gentleman, you will bear me out. Have I ever seen you? Have you ever seen me before this accursed hour?" "To speak for myself, I have never had that pleasure," answered the young man. "This is the first time, Ziri, that I have met with your engaging niece." The old gentleman shrugged his shoulders. "I am distressed to hear it," he said, "but it is never too late to begin. I had little more acquaintance with my own late lady ere I married her, which proves," he added with a grimace, "that these impromptu marriages may often produce an excellent understanding in the long run. As the bridegroom is to have a voice in the matter, I will give him 2 hours to make up for lost time before we proceed with the ceremony." And he turned toward the door, followed by the clergyman. The girl was at her feet in a moment. "My uncle, you cannot be honest," she said. "I declare before God I will stab myself rather than be forced on that young man. The heart rises at it. God forbids such marriages. You dishonor your white hair. Oh, my uncle, pity me. There is not a woman in all the world but would prefer death to such a nuptial. Is it possible," she added, faltering, "is it possible that you do not believe me, that you still think this," and she pointed at Denis with a tremor of anger and contempt, "that you still think this to be the man?" "Frankly," said the old gentleman, pausing on the threshold, "I do. But let me explain to you once for all, Blanche de Maletroit, my way of thinking about this affair. When you took it into your head to dishonor my family and the name that I have borne in peace and war for more than 60 years, you forfeited not only the right to question my designs, but that of looking me in the face. If your father had been alive, he would have spat on you and turned you out of doors. His was the hand of iron. You may bless your God. You have only to deal with the hand of velvet, mademoiselle. It was my duty to get you married without delay. Out of pure goodwill I have tried to find your own gallant for you, and I believe I have succeeded. But before God and all the holy angels, Blanche de Maletroit, if I have not, I care not one jack straw. So let me recommend you to be polite to our young friend, for upon my word your next groom may be less appetizing." And with that he went out, with the chaplain at his heels, and the arras fell behind the pair. The girl turned upon Denis with flashing eyes. "And what, sir," she demanded, "may be the meaning of all this?" "God knows," returned Denis gloomily. "I am a prisoner in this house, which seems full of mad people. More I know not, and nothing do I understand. And pray, how came you here?" she asked. He told her as briefly as he could. "For the rest," he added, "perhaps you will follow my example, and tell me the answer to all these riddles, and what in God's name is like to be the end of it." She stood silent for a little, and he could see her lips tremble and her tearless eyes burn with a feverish lustre. Then she pressed her forehead in both hands. "Alas, how my head aches," she said wearily, "to say nothing of my poor heart. But it is due to you to know my story, unmaidenly as it must seem. I am called Blanche de Maletroit. I have been without father or mother for as long as I can recollect, and indeed I have been most unhappy all my life. 3 months ago a young captain began to stand near me every day in church. I could see that I pleased him. I am much to blame. But I was so glad that any one should love me, and when he passed me a letter, I took it home with me and read it with great pleasure. Since that time he has written many. He was so anxious to speak with me, poor fellow, and kept asking me to leave the door open some evening, that we might have 2 words upon the stair. For he knew how much my uncle trusted me." She gave something like a sob at that, and it was a moment before she could go on. "My uncle is a hard man, but he is very shrewd," she said at last. "He has performed many feats in war, and was a great person at court, and much trusted by Queen Isabeau in old days. How he came to suspect me I cannot tell, but it is hard to keep anything from his knowledge, and this morning, as we came from mass, he took my hand in his, forced it open, and read my little billet, walking by my side all the while. When he had finished, he gave it back to me with great politeness. It contained another request to have the door left open, and this has been the ruin of us all. My uncle kept me strictly in my room until evening, and then ordered me to dress myself as you see me, a hard mockery for a young girl. Do you not think so? I suppose when he could not prevail with me to tell him the young captain's name, he must have laid a trap for him, unto which, alas, you have fallen in the anger of God. I looked for much confusion, for how could I tell whether he was willing to take me for his wife on these sharp terms? He might have been trifling with me from the first, or I might have made myself too cheap in his eyes. But truly I had not looked for such a shameful punishment as this. I could not think that God would let a girl be so disgraced before a young man. And now I have told you all, and I can scarcely hope that you will not despise me. End of section 17. Recorded by Edward Kirkby, Warwick, England.